April 13, 1743 was the day that what happened, Alec?
No Googling?
April 13, 1743.
1743.
That would have been Saturday, 1743. Reb?
No idea.
That's the day that Thomas Jefferson was born.
That was my second guess.
April 13, 1743. Out of respect and deference to the Honorable Thomas Jefferson, our second vice president and third American president, I found this, and we've read this before in the air, but I think this is so unbelievable when you read it. At 5, he began studying under his cousin's tutor. At 9, he studied Latin, Greek, and French. At 14, he studied classical literature and additional languages. At 16, he entered the College of William and Mary. Also could write in Greek with one hand while writing the same in Latin with the other. It's at 16. Show off. At 19, he studied law for 5 years, starting under George White. At 23, started his own law practice. At 25, was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. At 31, wrote the widely circulated Some Review of the Rights of British America and retired from his law practice. At 32, he was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. At 33, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. At 33, he took 3 years to revise Virginia's legal code and wrote a public education bill and a statute for religious freedom. At 36, was elected the second governor of Virginia, succeeding Patrick Henry. At 40, served in Congress for 2 years. At 41, was the American minister to France and negotiated commercial treaties with European nations along with Ben Franklin and John Adams. At 46, served as the first Secretary of State under George Washington. At 53, served as vice president and was elected president of the American Philosophical Society. At 55, drafted the Kentucky Resolutions and became the active head of the Republican Party. At 57, was elected the third president of the United States. At 60, obtained the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's acreage and size. At 61, was elected to a second term as American president. At 65, retired to Monticello. At 80, helped President Monroe shape the Monroe Doctrine. At 81, founded the University of Virginia and served as its first president. At 83, died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence along with John Adams. And then I've got this footnote. Thomas Jefferson knew because he himself studied the previous failed attempts of government. He understood actual history, the nature of God, his laws, and the nature of man. That happens to be way more than most understand today. Jefferson knew his stuff. A voice from the past to lead us into the future. John F. Kennedy held a dinner in the White House for a group of the brightest minds in the nation at the time. JFK made this statement: "This is perhaps the assembly of the most intelligence ever to gather at one time in the White House, with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." I just think that is such an amazing life and existence and contribution, not just to America, but just to mankind. There's some quotes here I've got written down that are attributed to Jefferson. Jefferson gets attributed a lot of quotes, gets accused of a lot of things that history says he may or may not have said. He did say this. You know, I've talked about how Jefferson really had disdain for cities. He didn't like cities. He romanced about rural America and an agrarian economy. That's a lot of the debate he and Hamiltonians had about the industrials and the agrarians. And, you know, we need this country to be about farming and expansive areas, and people don't need to be gommed up. He didn't use the word gommed up. That's a Pamplico word. But he did say this: when we get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as Europe. The democracy will cease to exist when you take away from those who are willing to work and give to those who would not.
Oh, wait a minute. What?
That's what he said. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted on, would save one half the wars of the world.
Wow.
I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. I want to read that again.
Yeah. I mean, all three of those quotes.
This is in the 1700s, folks, in the early 1800s. I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. My reading of history convinces me that most bad government results from too much government. No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny and government. That's why the liberals hate Jefferson. It's not the Jeffersonian philosophy. It is some of that because of limited government, the non-central planner, the states being able to kind of stake their own course and chart their own course and I guess decide their own fate and future. But a lot of it was the Second Amendment, because Jefferson was an outspoken advocate for the Second Amendment to the point that he really believed. I mean, you think about it. They were opposed to a tyranny. I mean, they were against the king. This is kind of an interesting quote. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Forever the revolutionary, Thomas Jefferson. To compel a man to subsidize with his taxes the propagation of ideas which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. You know what I think of when I read that? Hobby Lobby. Remember the contraception issue within the abortion issue, the abortion pill. Here I am with air quotes again. I think Jefferson was looking clearly not at Hobby Lobby. I mean, obviously Jefferson didn't know there'd be a company owned by Christians who sold a bunch of gadgets and stuff that you make, baskets you put on your table at Thanksgiving. But to compel a man to subsidize with his taxes the propagation of ideas which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson said in 1802, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless of their continent their fathers conquered. I just think those are so on point from somebody who was born in 1743. And, Bob Dylan wrote a song, The Times They Are Changing, and they are. I mean, there's no question about that, and things are very different today than they were previous. But we talk about geniuses. We talk about smart people. Thomas Jefferson was a political theorist, no question about it. But Thomas Jefferson's version and view of government was genius. I mean, it was absolutely genius, the way he perceived government, the way he perceived the relationship mankind has with its government. He was probably, Hancock deserves a lot of credit here. Probably as staunch a revolutionary as there was as a part of the American Revolution. I mean, they were all revolutionaries. But when you look at Hancock and Jefferson, will you give me your John Hancock? I mean, the story behind, John Hancock wrote his name in essence saying, yes, sir, King, it's clear what I wrote. Mm-hmm. And I'm not bashful about it. I'm not shying away from it. Well, Jefferson was very similar to that. There's a story. And if you watch the miniseries John Adams, Jefferson was not a great speaker at all. Had a bit of a lisp. Wrote about 26,000 letters in his life. And he was a great writer and a great thinker, but he was not a great speaker at all. And in the First Continental Congress, John Adams was kind of leading the charge. Adams was kind of the loudest and most influential voice. I mean, you had Washington and Franklin, but a lot of people believed that Adams and Jefferson were the North and South Pole of our revolution. They fought for what we did. The others were obviously enormous contributors. I mean, Franklin and Madison and Washington were, and Hamilton for that matter. And, they were amazing contributors, but most people believe that Adams and Jefferson fought. They were the North and South Pole, but there's an interesting debate as to whether this conversation ever took place or not. But when they were debating basically seceding from British rule, Jefferson had not said much in the Congress. And they walk outside taking a break, and Adams comes up to Jefferson because they were friends and foes. I mean, you know, their life was very complex. It was very united at times and very conflicted at other times. And they were political friends and political foes, and that's kind of the intrigue of the Adams-Jefferson relationship. But they were outside of the congressional. It wouldn't be the chamber at the time. I guess we'd call it the chamber today. But and Adams came up to Jefferson and said, "Mr. Jefferson, you've not said more than a handful of words this entire session. Is it clear? Am I clear where you come from?" In other words, he thought he knew exactly where Jefferson was because Jefferson was the consummate revolutionary, but he hadn't said much. And Jefferson responded, rumor is, tall tale, nostalgic history says that Jefferson looked at Adams and said, "I have no gift of orator." And Adams said, kind of a nudge and said, "Well, I mean, where do you stand?" And Jefferson said, I get chills when I say this. Jefferson said, "I'd spend every ounce of blood in my body to sink the island of Great Britain in the ocean." And they say that the enthusiasm in Adams's eyes was like, excuse my French, I'm not even going to say that because that's inappropriate, but it was almost like, yes.
Yeah. Heck yeah.
Yeah. If we've got this guy as passionate about it as he appears to be. He always thought he knew Jefferson was that passionate about it. But in the Congression, when they were debating some of these issues, Jefferson just didn't say much. But when he looked Adams in the eyes and said, "I would spill every ounce of blood in my body to sink the island of Great Britain in the ocean," he was the consummate revolutionary. And I don't know. He's my political hero. I take liberties with this show at times with Springsteen and the Gamecocks and Thomas Jefferson. But I'll tell you, we live in existence. We enjoy a quality of life, not solely and all about Thomas Jefferson, but he was the consummate revolutionary. And I just got to believe that we were talking about last week, you know, the government's conning the American public. They're not subservient to the American public. They don't look after the interest of the average American. I think Jefferson would vomit on the doorsteps of Washington. I think if Jefferson were alive today and could understand what our government has done to the greatest experiment in the history of man's relationship with government, I think he would find it probably as offensive as the king. But we don't have a Thomas Jefferson as we speak. I've said this before, and I think this is such a compelling point to make. No mention on his headstone of being president of the United States. Only mentions that he founded the University of Virginia. He authored the Declaration of Independence, and there was a statue in Virginia about the encouragement of religious freedoms. And that's something he was very, very, very proud of. He was actually the designer. He was an architect. He designed the Virginia State Capitol, the Rotunda at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and Monticello. It took him 40 years to finish Monticello because he wanted the angles to be right, and you know what I mean? And that's where he invented the swivel chair. That's pretty crazy, Rev. I mean, just think of that. I've got this room, and I've created all these unusual angles because it's fun, and I'm a kind of a self-taught architect. But all the chairs, I mean, I can't get the chairs where people can converse or conversate with one another. What do I do here? Wonder if I could make the chair swivel. I mean, that's crazy. But anyway, and Thomas Jefferson was the president of the American Philosophical Society. Donald Trump is not, just in case you're wondering. Donald Trump is not a former chair or former president of the American Philosophical Association. But happy birthday to the late, great Thomas Jefferson, April 13, 1743.
You realized that on Saturday?
I did.
And it filled an entire segment of the show.
I did. And I made my mind up then. I wrote a note on my phone.
Those quotes are incredible.
They're timeless.
Yeah.
I mean, they're unbelievably timeless.
In the context of today.
It's almost like Jefferson had a crystal ball.
True.
And he said, we start trusting man to govern other men. You better be careful with man abusing that authority and privilege. And let's put these checks in place. And we've rolled over those checks and balances like a locomotive. Back in a minute. Good morning, PD, Live 95.